Over the skies of Europe, where the wind carried the scent of oil blood and gunpowder, there flew a machine once hailed as the invincible flying fortress. But inside that fortress lay a frozen hell. The B-17 Flying Fortress was more than a symbol of American air power in World War II. It was a symbol of sacrifice, of the price paid for victory, and of the dangerous illusion of invincibility itself. They called it a fortress, yet every mission was a gamble with death. While the public gazed upward, admiring the proud formations cutting across the sky, few understood that inside those unpressurized cockpits, death lingered in every breath, every freezing gust, every bullet tearing through the paper-thin skin of metal. This video does not merely list 122 shocking facts. It is a journey into the dark side of a legend where glory and tragedy become one. If you've ever believed that war is a heroic symphony of technology and human will, then prepare to see the raw truth hidden behind the roar of the Wright Cyclone engines thundering above the European skies. Before the skies over Germany became the graveyard of flying fortresses, tragedy had already begun at home, on the training fields of America and Britain. As the war escalated, the United States was forced to cut pilot training programs from 9 months down to just 9 weeks. A technical adjustment on paper, yet behind it lay 25,000 erased lives.
And in the midst of that vast ocean, one tiny speck was about to become the eye of the storm. Wake Island.
They died while still learning how to take off. Imagine this 19 and 20-year-old boys fresh out of school thrown into the cockpit of a massive 16-ton aircraft and told to master it amid the dense fog of Britain's endless gray skies. Before they ever faced the Luftwaffe, they had to fight nature, mechanical failure, and their own fear. Mid-air collisions, explosions echoing through the clouds, aircraft plunging into the fields below. These were not mere training accidents. They were the price of industrial warfare, where human lives were traded for production quotas and mission schedules. They called the B-17 the Flying Fortress. Yet when you look at the deaths that happened before a single combat sortie, you can't help but ask, was it truly a fortress? Or a steel coffin for the dreams of youth? And that is where the legend of the B-17 truly begins, not in glory, but in a nightmare born from the dream of conquering the sky.
But on the night of December 7th, the radios crackled with a message that froze every heart. Pearl Harbor has been attacked. And just hours later, that nightmare crossed the ocean, straight toward Wake. At noon on December 8th, 1941, wake time, the sky suddenly trembled.
The B-17, the so-called Flying Fortress, was anything but comfortable. It had no pressurized cabin.
Flames roared, thick smoke billowed skyward, and within minutes, half of Wake's air power was gone. 23 pilots killed, 11 wounded.
A few minutes without oxygen, and a man would fall asleep, a sleep from which he'd never wake. They depended on fragile oxygen bottles and primitive electric heated suits, both easily destroyed by shrapnel or power failure. A single malfunction could turn a young man into a frozen statue drifting in the cold void. Veterans would later recall flying in a B-17 was like driving a convertible at 200 miles per hour through air 50 degrees below zero.
The smoke from December 8th had barely lifted when the men on Wake began to grasp the truth. They were on the front line of a hopeless war.
Touch a gun barrel without gloves, and you might lose your skin or your fingers.
He believed that if he moved fast enough, he could liberate Manila before it burned to the ground.
But inside it was a frozen prison. There were no heroes up there, only men struggling to survive minute by minute, inside a machine stripped of all humanity. And so the question remains, what made them keep flying? Keep returning to a sky that seemed determined to kill them? If cold and oxygen starvation were the silent killers, then once the B-17s crossed the English Channel, those dangers were no longer threats. They were merely the prelude to the real nightmare. On the far side of the sky, the enemy waited. And here death had a name, a face, and a sound: Flak and Luftwaffe. The skies over Germany were not just filled with clouds. They were choked with black smoke from millions of 88mm shells. Every burst was a roll of the dice with death. A single near miss could tear open the duralumin skin of a bomber like paper, or cut a crewman in half, leaving behind images that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. One pilot later said, "We didn't fly through clouds. We flew through a sea of black smoke where death was hiding." But making it through that wall of fire was only the beginning.
In the skies above, Captain Henry T. Elrod, one of the few surviving pilots of VMF 211, dove like a blade of steel, releasing a bomb squarely onto the destroyer Kisaragi. The explosion ripped the ship apart in seconds.
Their speed was so terrifying that a single burst from their 20mm or 30mm cannons could turn a flying fortress into a fireball in seconds. In those few heartbeats, the fate of 10 men was decided.
When American troops crossed the Estero de la Reina Bridge, they were met with a storm of bullets and 500-pound bombs.
The sky became a lethal lottery where skill, luck, and faith in your crewmates were all that stood between you and oblivion. And still, amid the thunder of flak and gunfire, one question echoed through the heavens. How did they keep flying into a place no one ever wanted to return to? The dogfights with the Luftwaffe had already turned the skies of Europe into a place where men and machines burned together. But by 1943, that war crossed a terrible threshold, one where courage alone was no longer enough to survive. If death had once lurked in the black clouds of flak, now the entire sky over Germany had become a graveyard. The twin bombing raids on Regensburg and Schweinfurt stand as the most painful proof of that truth. On August 17, 1943, 376 B-17s took off driven by faith in the strategy that destroying German industry from the air would shorten the war. But when the mission ended, 60 bombers never returned and 600 airmen were missing or dead. That day, the sky burned red with exploding aircraft, a storm of steel so violent that even the few who survived rarely spoke of it again. Two months later, on October 14, 1943, they flew again, same target, same faith. And the nightmare repeated itself. 291 bombers launched, 77 shot down, 120 badly damaged. The casualty rate shattered every limit of endurance. Airmen would forever remember it as Black Thursday. American commanders were forced to confront a horrifying question. Was it worth continuing a campaign where only 1 out of 3 crews could expect to survive 25 missions? The so-called flying fortresses were praised for their strength and bravery, yet over Schweinfurt's smoke-filled skies, they became nothing more than flying tombs, each carrying 10 young men to their fiery deaths. And in that moment, war ceased to be strategy. It became desperation with wings of steel. It doesn't need satellites or guidance systems, only a steady-handed soldier. But for the men of the B-17, that was only the beginning, the passage from hell in the sky to hell on the ground. As the aircraft shook violently, engines burning bright red, the pilot's final command echoed through the intercom. Bailout. Jump to live. But statistics told a cruel truth. Barely half ever made it out before their flying fortress exploded. And even when a parachute opened, survival was far from certain. Many airmen were shot while hanging helplessly in midair, turning a fleeting moment of hope into one of sheer despair. Those who reached the ground faced a different kind of horror, the fury of the German civilians. To them, these young Americans weren't soldiers. They were murderers, from the skymen who had killed their families with bombs. Hundreds of lynchings followed across Germany, the most infamous being the Rüsselsheim massacre, where 6 captured airmen were beaten to death with rocks and clubs by an enraged mob. The survivors were sent to Luftwaffe POW camps, where hunger, disease, and cold claimed them slowly. Around 1,300 men died behind the barbed wire. Those who lived to see liberation weighed barely 40 kilograms, little more than skin and bone with hollow eyes that had seen too much. They had survived flak German fighters in skies filled with burning planes, only to learn that war offered no safe place, neither above the clouds nor on the earth below.
Yet within that moment of triumph, Manila was dying, slowly, painfully, day by day.
The B-17 pilots who returned from the skies over Germany carried empty eyes. They had seen too much comrades burning alive villages, screaming beneath their bombs. And as the war dragged on, one truth became painfully clear. The survivors were no longer heroes. They were cogs in a vast killing machine called victory. At first, the Allied air strategy seemed righteous to strike at factories, fuel depots, and military bases, crippling the Nazi war machine. But as the failures mounted and the pressure to win at any cost grew, that purpose began to twist. The Flying Fortress, once a symbol of strength and courage, had become an instrument of annihilation. The B-17 alone dropped more than 640,000 tons of bombs out of the 1.6 million tons unleashed by the Allies over Europe. More than 120 German cities were leveled. In Hamburg, 40,000 people perished in a sea of fire. In Dresden, a city with no real military value, the bombing went on for 3 days, burning 25,000 civilians alive. They called it an air victory, but on the ground, it was hell itself. Children, the elderly, and women consumed by the infernos of strategic bombing. When the smoke finally cleared, the world began to ask, can it still be called justice if humanity must be saved by destroying it? And within that question, the image of the B-17 changed forever. No longer the emblem of heroism, but a mirror reflecting the terrible cost of modern war, where morality is crushed between the roar of bombs and the cheers of triumph. After the bombing campaigns that rained fire and ashes across Europe, many believed the sky had become nothing more than a symbol of destruction. But amid the wreckage, humanity witnessed the unbelievable stories that defied the laws of physics and even fate itself. One of those legends was the All-American. During a 1943 mission, a German fighter rammed into the bomber, slicing almost its entire tail clean off. And yet impossibly, the B-17 held together, balanced steady, as if sheer human will had overcome gravity itself. With the help of its comrades, it flew more than 300 kilometers and landed safely.
2 days later, the finance building collapsed, and General Griswold sent a brief message to Kruger. All resistance has ended.
Then there was Alan McGee, who fell from 6,000 meters without a parachute, crashed through a train station roof, and somehow lived with 28 wounds and a life that continued until age 84. Or Eugene Moran and James, who plummeted to Earth inside a detached tail section, only to be cradled by a forest canopy that broke their fall like an act of divine mercy. And finally, the story of lovely Julie, a B-17 whose entire nose was blown off the cockpit, exposed to roaring wind. Yet the pilot still flew it home and was awarded the Silver Star. These stories force us to pause and ask, in war, could survival itself be the most irrational miracle of all? In a world where men sought to destroy one another, these feats were more than mere luck. They were proof that even in the heart of hell, the instinct to live remained the most sacred thing left. Those miraculous tales of survival marked the closing chapter of the B-17's epic story, not just as legends of heroism, but as solemn reminders of the price humanity paid to touch the sky. Because behind every miracle lay hundreds of forgotten tragedies, and behind every legend stood countless unmarked graves scattered across Britain, Germany, and the cold floor of the Atlantic. The B-17 flying fortress, that legendary warplane, was celebrated as a symbol of strength, faith, and victory. But for those who once sat inside its cockpit, it was no symbol at all. It was a fragile aluminum coffin hanging in the sky. They took off believing they were saving the world, never realizing that the very heavens they rose to conquer would devour their youth, their dreams, and sometimes their humanity. In every mission lived both the beauty of mechanical perfection and the inhuman cruelty of modern war. The roar of the Wright Cyclone engines was like the heartbeat of a civilization racing toward its own destruction. And as those steel fortresses burned bright against the clouds, it became impossible to tell where glory ended and hell began. This documentary, through the lens of Indy Nadell, is not merely about the B-17. It is about humanity itself, about men intoxicated by victory and later sobered by guilt, about a generation who believed they were writing history, never realizing they were writing it in their own blood. And as the screen fades to black, one question still echoes: was there ever truly a victor in war, or only survivors left to tell the tale?